The wind had teeth, and it was biting hard at the edges of Redemption Gulch. Eli Hartley felt it on the back of his neck, a cold promise of what was coming. He leaned against the rough-hewn porch post of the general store, his weight settled on one leg, his hat pulled low, his gaze fixed on the pass, a jagged cut in the gray muscle of the mountains where the stagecoach road disappeared. It was the last one. After this, the snows would close that pass like a fist, and the world would shrink to the size of his valley until spring. He was not a man given to impatience, but a quiet tension coiled in his gut. Answering the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times had been an act of pure, cold logic. His homestead was 2 days, ride from anywhere, a lonely patch of existence carved out of timber and rock. Winters were the worst. The silence grew so loud it felt like a presence in the cabin, a ghost that sat in the empty chair across from him. He didn't need a wife for love. The notion was as foreign and impractical as raising orchids in a blizzard. He needed a partner, someone to share the burden, to keep the crushing solitude at bay. The advertisement he'd answered had been simple: plain woman of good character, seeking a husband and a home, willing to work and share the burdens of frontier life. He'd sent back an equally spare reply, enclosing the fare for her passage. He expected someone sturdy, with hands used to work, and a face weathered by practicality. He expected a woman who understood survival. The distant rumble grew louder until the coach lurched into view, coated in dust that looked like a premonition of snow. It pulled to a halt in a jangle of tired harnesses and the blowing of weary horses. A few townsfolk paused their errands to watch. The last stage of the season was always an event. It was the final link to the world outside, and everyone who got off it was here to stay, for better or worse. The driver, a burly man named Silas, swung down and opened the door. A man in a drummer's suit got out first, stamping his feet and looking around with disdain. Then, after a long pause, she appeared. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. This was not what anyone had expected, least of all Eli. The woman who stepped down onto the frozen mud was thin, so slender a hard wind might carry her away. She was trembling, a fine, constant tremor that shook the delicate lace collar of her dress. The dress itself was a whisper of a thing. Dark blue wool, trimmed with fragile adornments, meant for eastern parlors, not the raw edge of the wilderness. It was wholly inadequate for the cold, and she folded into herself, arms wrapped tight around her body. Eli pushed himself off the post. He heard the whispers. Too fine for this place. Hartley's got himself a porcelain doll. He ignored them. The opinions of others were among the first things he'd stopped carrying long ago. He walked toward her, boots thudding on the hard-packed dirt. Her head was down, but she sensed his approach and flinched when he stopped in front of her. When she lifted her eyes, they were the color of a winter sky before a storm. Deep, troubled gray, wide with fear that had nothing to do with the cold. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She gave a small, jerky nod, her throat working as if to swallow a word that wouldn't come. The wind gusted again, whipping a strand of her dark hair across her pale cheek. She shivered violently. Eli shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat. It smelled of pine, smoke, leather, and the clean air of the mountains. He held it out. When his hand brushed her arm, she recoiled. It wasn't a large movement, just a sharp, involuntary jerk, like she'd been burned. He didn't understand. For a moment, he thought she might bolt. He held still, coat extended, posture calm, the way he would with a spooked mare. Finally, the logic of the cold won out. She gave a tiny nod and allowed him to drape the coat over her narrow shoulders. It swallowed her whole. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely carried by the wind. He retrieved her luggage, a single battered satchel, and gestured toward his wagon. The ride back to his homestead was steeped in silence. The wheels groaned through the frozen ruts, while the wind moaned through the pines. Eli's hands were steady on the reins, his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was aware of the woman beside him, rigid, with fear and cold. She didn't look at the scenery or the pale winter sun. She just stared ahead, knuckles white around her satchel handle. Her profile was delicate but drawn, tight with exhaustion. She looked like a woman who had been running for a long time and had finally stopped, too tired to know where she'd ended up. The silence wasn't companionable. It was a chasm. Eli had no idea how to bridge it. By dusk they arrived. His cabin sat nestled in a clearing backed by tall pines, smoke curling from its chimney. To him it was home, solid, simple, and earned. To her, he suspected, it looked like the end of the world. Inside, the room was spare but warm. A stone fireplace, a rough table, 2 chairs, and a single bed. He pointed out her small room, partitioned by a new wooden wall. Inside it, a narrow bed with a faded quilt. His mother's. "This will be your room," he said. She stepped in, ran a trembling hand over the quilt, and whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Hartley. It is very clean." He nodded. In the lamplight, he noticed her hands properly for the first time. From knuckles to wrists, they were mottled with dark bruises, sickly yellow and violet. "How did you hurt your hands?" he asked. Her eyes dropped instantly. "I fell," she said flatly, hiding them in her dress folds. Eli didn't press. He knew a wall when he saw one, and she was built from them. That night, as snow began to fall, the world shrank to the size of the little cabin. The fire glowed, casting long, flickering shadows on the walls. He heard the faint sound of weeping from behind the curtain that served as her door, a muffled, stifled sorrow. He lay staring into the dark, every instinct urging him to comfort her. But he knew better. He didn't know her story yet. He only knew the storm had just begun. The morning came gray and brittle, the kind that froze every sound before it could travel. Kora Whitmore woke before dawn, shivering beneath the patchwork quilt. For a moment she was disoriented, her mind still trapped between 2 worlds, one of marble floors and whispered cruelty, the other of pine walls and silence. Then it all came back. The stagecoach, the stranger with kind eyes and calloused hands, the storm closing in around them, a hollow ache pressed against her ribs, the echo of everything she had lost and everything she still feared. But beneath it flickered a small, stubborn spark of will. She would not be a burden. She would make herself useful. Pulling on her plain wool dress, she crept into the main room. Eli Hartley was still asleep, a still mountain of a man under the heavy blanket. The fire had burned down to pale embers. She moved quietly, kneeling by the stove. Back home, servants had done such things. Here, she would learn. Her bruised hands fumbled with the kindling. She dropped a stick, and it clattered loudly on the wooden floor. From behind her came a low rustle, the sound of him waking. "The flue needs to be open," his voice said, deep and rough with sleep. She froze. Then, slowly, she turned. Eli was sitting up on the edge of the bed, pulling on his boots. His hair was mussed, his expression calm. He didn't seem angry, only awake. He rose, crossing to her with quiet steps. She tensed, her fingers curling around the kindling. But when he reached past her, it was only to lift a small iron lever on the stovepipe. "There," he said, matter of fact. "Let the smoke out first." He crouched beside her and arranged the wood, striking a match. The fire came alive, small tongues of orange licking at the dry bark. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes on the flames. "I was only trying to help." "I know," he said simply. The warmth grew between them, faint, uncertain, but real. Through the day, the rhythm of survival settled between them. Kora worked quietly, cleaning, mending, and preparing what little food there was. Eli repaired a broken gate outside, his movements steady and sure. Every so often, he'd glance through the window and see her bent over her sewing, the firelight gilding her brown hair. She learned quickly. Though she was a creature born of parlors and lace, she did not shy from work. When he showed her how to feed the animals in the barn, she followed in silence, her breath misting in the cold air. The horses startled her at first, their size and heat, but soon they calmed under her soft voice. There was a stillness to her, not peace, but endurance. By dusk, the snow began again, heavy and unrelenting. The wind screamed through the trees, slamming against the cabin walls. Eli worked to bank the fire, but the cold pushed through every crack, crawling across the floor like a living thing. He laid out both their blankets by the hearth. "It's too cold to sleep apart," he said, practical and direct. Her throat tightened. "I'll be fine." "You'll freeze," he replied. "The fire's fighting a losing battle." For a long moment, neither moved. Then she nodded, gathering her blanket and sitting across from him by the fire. The space between them felt like a fragile line neither dared cross. They sat for hours, listening to the storm. The fire cracked and hissed. Their breath hung in the air, small ghosts of life fading into the shadows. Kora's hands trembled as she tried to undo the laces of her dress, stiff with cold. Her fingers were numb, the ribbons slick and impossible. She bit her lip, frustration burning in her chest. "Mr. Hartley," she whispered, barely audible above the wind. He looked up from the fire. "Eli," he said quietly. She hesitated. "Eli, I can't manage my laces. My hands are too cold." For a heartbeat, he didn't move. Then he stood and crossed the space between them. He did not stand over her. Instead, he knelt, a large man making himself small. "Hold still," he murmured. His fingers brushed the small of her back. They were rough, work-hardened, but impossibly gentle. He worked the knot loose with steady patience, his breath slow and controlled. She could feel the warmth of him even through the fabric, and for the first time in years, a man's touch didn't make her flinch. Her heart pounded so loud she feared he might hear it. When the ribbon came free, he rose, stepping back immediately. "Your dress is undone," he said, his voice low. Then he turned to face the fire, giving her privacy. The silence that followed was thick, with something neither of them dared name. Later, lying in their separate beds, they listened to the storm rage outside. The wind clawed at the windows, snow whispering against the glass. Yet beneath that fury was a different kind of quiet. The fragile, trembling quiet of two people beginning to thaw. The days blurred into each other. The storm refused to let up. The cabin grew colder, their woodpile shrinking. They burned sparingly, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Frost rimed the windows like white lace. By the third day, Kora's lips were pale, her voice weak from the chill. Eli saw her hands trembling as she tried to sew by the fire. He took the needle from her fingers, wordless, and handed her a tin cup of steaming broth. She looked at him with tired eyes. "You'll run out of wood," she said softly. "I'll cut more," he answered. Outside, he split logs until his shoulders ached, the rhythmic crack of the axe echoing through the white silence. Inside, she kept the fire alive. It was a partnership forged in necessity, quiet, imperfect, human. On the fifth night, the wind reached a fevered pitch, screaming through the trees like something alive. The cabin shuddered under its assault. They sat shoulder to shoulder before the fire, their blankets drawn tight. The cold pressed in from every wall. Kora's voice trembled when she spoke. "You said this happens every winter?" "Not like this," Eli said. "This one feels mean." She smiled faintly. "You talk about the weather as if it has feelings." He stared into the fire. "Sometimes I think it does." For a long moment there was only the sound of the storm. Then she turned her face toward him, her expression soft and uncertain. "Why did you send for me?" she asked. He met her eyes. "Because the cabin was too quiet." Something in her chest cracked open at that, something old and bruised. She nodded, blinking back tears that had nothing to do with the cold. The storm howled outside, furious and wild, but inside, something small and tender was beginning to take root. That night, when she lay in her bed, she did not cry. She listened instead, to the steady rhythm of his breathing through the thin wall, to the wind that battered the roof, and to the faint, defiant beat of her own heart. It was the first night in years that she felt she might survive the winter. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world remade in white. The trees bowed under the weight of snow, and the valley lay silent, wrapped in a hush so deep it seemed sacred. The cabin stood firm, its chimney sending up a thin ribbon of smoke into a sky scrubbed clean by the wind. Inside, the peace was fragile, but real. Kora moved with quiet confidence now. She had learned to coax life out of the stove, to patch clothes, to milk the cow without flinching. Her cheeks carried the faintest blush of health. Eli noticed every small change, the steadier rhythm of her hands, the way her eyes met his, now without fear. But the blizzard had taken its toll. Supplies were low, and both of them knew that survival was still a daily choice. Eli's shoulder ached from the chopping, his breath visible even indoors. Kora kept the fire going, humming soft melodies from her old life, filling the cabin with something new, something warm. Then, one morning, she didn't rise. Her skin was flushed, her breathing shallow. The fire had burned down to embers, and the stew from the night before sat untouched. Eli crouched beside her, touching her forehead. The heat that met his palm filled him with dread. "You're burning up," he murmured. "I'm fine." She tried to whisper, but the effort sent her into a coughing fit. He didn't hesitate. He laid her back gently, grabbed blankets, and threw more wood into the stove. He melted snow, brewed herbs from his mother's old tin, and sat beside her for hours, sponging her face with cool water. For 2 days he barely slept. He fed her in small spoonfuls, held her when the fever shakes came, and whispered steady words when she moaned names he didn't recognize. One name returned again and again, Julian. It wasn't his name, but it was carved into her soul. On the 3rd night, the fever broke. She woke weak but lucid, her eyes clear and rimmed with tears. Eli sat slumped in the chair beside her bed, his head bowed, exhaustion written in every line of his body. "You stayed," she whispered. "Where else would I go?" Quote. A silence stretched between them, the kind that carried everything words could never hold. Then, quietly, she said, "Julian was my husband. He's dead now, but he never left me." Eli didn't speak, he only looked at her, waiting. "He broke me before he died," she continued. Her voice trembled, but there was steel in it now. "He wanted to own everything, even the parts of me that were meant to be mine. When I ran, I thought distance would set me free, but I still wake up waiting for his hand." She turned her face away, ashamed of the tears that followed. But Eli didn't flinch. He reached out, took her hand, and held it. Solid, warm, unshakable. "You don't belong to ghosts," he said. "You belong to yourself now." Her shoulders shook once, then stilled. For the first time, she let herself believe him. Days passed. Strength returned. So did laughter. Soft, uncertain at first, then brighter. She began humming again, and he started to whistle, the two sounds twining together like smoke. They learned the small rhythm of each other's presence. A touch to the shoulder when passing by, a shared cup of coffee in silence. When the snow softened, he brought her outside to feel the sun. The world glittered. Melt water trickled in rivulets down the slope, and the air smelled of pine and thawing earth. Kora tilted her face to the light and smiled. Not the polite kind she used to give strangers, but a real, radiant smile. That night, as the fire burned low, she sat brushing her hair in front of the hearth. The glow painted her in gold. Eli watched her from the table, the book in his hands forgotten. She felt his gaze and turned, her eyes catching the light. "Do you still see a broken woman?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "I see a woman still standing." Her lips curved, soft and true. She set the brush aside and crossed the small room to him. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. No storm, no past, no ghosts. Just two souls who had weathered their own winters. When she reached for his hand, he met her halfway. She took his large, rough palm and pressed it flat against her chest, over her heart. Her voice came as a whisper, the same words that had once begun this fragile, impossible thing between them. "Touch me like you mean it." It wasn't a plea this time. It was a vow. He did. He touched her as if every scar, every bruise, every loss had led them here. His fingers traced the outline of her life, slow and reverent. When he kissed her, it wasn't a claim or a conquest. It was a promise. They found each other in that firelight, not as savior and saved, but as equals. Two people remade in the warmth of something neither had believed they deserved. Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and slow, a benediction instead of a curse. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, and for the first time all winter, it was truly warm. When dawn came, Kora stirred in his arms. The wind had quieted. The world outside was white and pure, a clean slate. She smiled, her cheek pressed against his chest. "Still beating," she whispered. Eli kissed her hair, his voice low and steady. "Always will." And in that cabin on the edge of the wild, where once there had been only cold and silence, two broken hearts found a home.